Let's get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Kamal Obri. I'm an Exchange Premier Field Engineer based out of New York, New Jersey region. We are part of a global business support organization within Microsoft, and we primarily support enterprise customers with Exchange deployments, Office 365 deployments through all phases like planning, migration, or even when they are in the run state as well. So, we wanted to put together this session about our field experiences with Office 365, the most common issues we see in the environments, and also what are the most common questions that customers ask us, so that when you go back to your customers, you're actually ready, or when you're actually doing the migrations, you know about these issues, you can proactively help them, resolve those issues easily. So, to start off, I want to thank my colleagues first, acknowledging the people that helped me put together the slides. Some of them are here. Patrick, who is our dedicated Office 365 engineer. If you have any questions around dedicated Office 365, definitely ask Patrick. Also have Dave Bonnet, who deals with the public sector business within Office 365. Like, he's the one that deals with most of the public sector questions. So if you have any questions around public sector, just definitely ask Dave Bonnet. And I usually deal with multi-tenant customers that are on the commercial side. So any questions that you have around multi-tenancy and customers that are on the commercial side, just ping me. So as far as our agenda goes, primarily we are looking at two things. We want to give you resources that can help you move to Office 365 easily, so that you're properly planned. You have all the things that are available for you to move to Office 365, as well as share some of our experiences, some of the issues that we saw in the field when people are actually migrating to Office 365, as well as when they are in run state, like when they are completely migrated to Office 365, what are the common issues that they saw, and how do you, support them. So the way the presentation is going to go is, we usually start with the planning phase within Office 365, then we'll go into the migrate phase, and then we'll go into the deploy phase, and then the maintain phase. Basically saying, these are the 4 stages where you may have to support your customers, and we'll look into them in detail. So when you're in the planning phase, the first thing we want to look into is service descriptions within Office 365. So the question for that group here is, how many of you actually have read Office 365 service descriptions? Quite a few. So as you know, and for the people who are not, who did not read through, this is, I would say, a must-read for any Exchange admin that's supporting Office 365 customers. Now, this is the place where you will actually find detailed information around what's in Office 365, what are the services that are available, what are the features that are available. Now, the reason we wanted to put this together is some of the common questions we get asked, when customers are talking about Office 365 is, what's my mailbox size limits that I get with Office 365? What are my message rate limits? These are the things that are important for you to understand in terms of, what does Office 365 provide to my customers or to provide to my company. So it does answer a lot of questions, around like, what are the SLAs that you have? Is public folder supported within Office 365? What are the features that I have with the plan I get? If I pick a particular plan like a E1, what are the features that I have with that particular plan? We also look at recipient limits. All this information is in there. And the reason why we wanted to bring this up is one thing. First, when customers go to Office 365, most of them, what we have seen is they do a cost-benefit analysis, saying, how does Office 365 help me, basically, saving the cost. But most of them, what we have seen is they don't do a due diligence on actually understanding what's available in Office 365 and actually leverage those functionalities, or make sure that they align to those services. A good example being recipient limits. For people who are in the room who read service descriptions, does anybody know what's the maximum size of a message that you can send if it is sent to a large DL? Any guesses? Close. Right. Yeah, it's 2 MB. See, and that's important, right? So when you are actually supporting your customers, you have to understand if my end user calls me back and says, hey, I'm not able to send to a large DL, why? That's because the service does not support it. The main thing I want you to take away from this is Office 365 is a highly configurable system. You can configure a lot of things within Office 365, but you cannot customize it. Now, most of you coming from on-prem support organizations usually have policies around increasing those limits, right? For example, somebody says, hey, I want a 5 gig mailbox. Manager gets escalated, you get a 5 gig mailbox. Now, if somebody says, I want a 50 gig mailbox or a 100 gig mailbox within Office 365, right? 50 gig is our limit. How do I increase that? It's not possible. And you have to work within these limitations now and make sure that you follow those guidelines as well. The second question we get asked most of the time is, what are the security, privacy, and compliance features within Office 365? Now, we do have a website called trustoffice365.com. It basically gives you all the resources that you need to talk to your legal teams or the e-discovery teams or whoever is working with those compliance needs. To go to this website, there are security white papers that are published there. There are guidance around what we do within Office 365. Things like what are the certifications do we have? Do you have the ISO 27001 certification? What's the privacy policy that Office 365 offers? Especially with this recent government snooping thing that came up, that information is available on the Trust Office 365 site. What are the security practices that you employ? From basic hardware security to the campus security to data access security. All that's available at that location as well. And also the design principles. When you are designing Office 365 for high availability, disaster recovery, what are the design principles that Office 365 employs? So that's the location you want to go to for getting this information. Now, one interesting question that I get asked when I specify about this is, so you say that Office 365 is ISO 27001 compliant or HIPAA compliant, right? So does that mean that if I move my customers or if I move my company to Office 365, do I become HIPAA compliant? And the answer is no. See, Office 365 helps you be compliant with HIPAA, right? So it's your responsibility to make sure that you configure Office 365 in such a way that you become HIPAA compliant, okay? Now, the last resource that I want to provide you is the Office 365 deployment guide. Now that you have done your planning, you understood what's in Office 365, you understood the privacy policy, the security policy that's available. Now you want to move into, okay, now I want to go to Office 365. How do I start? How do I pilot Office 365? Do I need directory synchronization? Is that a need for me? Do I need ADFS within the environment? Do I need to set up hybrid? What type of migration do I use? Do I use a hybrid migration? Do I use, a cutover migration? So all this information is very helpful, and to help you understand, the guide helps you, guide through that process. It has things like, for example, what's my project plans going to look when I want to move to Office 365? What are the different resources that I need? It also has some templates. For example, I'm doing my migration. I have to have a template to send to Office 365 users who, when I move them to Office 365, it has some email templates that you can leverage. So it's a complete guide which can help you through the end-to-end process. Okay? So you can go to the shortcuts there, aka.ms.office365 deploy, and it will redirect to the right location. So those are the most common questions we get asked. These are the common resources that we give to our customers when we when we get asked those questions. Now let's get technical a little bit, and then we are going to talk about the deployment readiness. And we as PFEs, are more about being proactive. We want to help customers so that in such a way that they are proactive, they run their environment in a healthy state, right? So the next 3 slides, we're going to talk about the things before you start the actual migration to Office 365, things that you need to remember, things that you need to do within your environment, so that when you actually start the migration or start the directory synchronization, these are the things that you need to look into. The first one being the tenant name. How many of you have signed up for tenant names or signed up for Office 365? So one thing you want to remember is the tenant name that you use during your sign up is going to stay with you. You cannot change that name. You cannot remove that name. Now, that every user that gets a mailbox within Office 365 Exchange Online is going to get an email address that's that's associated with that tenant name. So it is very important for you to choose the right tenant name. Okay, and it is a first come first serve basis, right? Which means that there's one reason why all of you need to sign up for Office 365 today, right? So, and look out for test and eval incidents. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is we run into scenarios where customers sign up for Office 365 and they'll do, one customer we recently helped out created a tenant, they were testing it out, they were piloting it, they said, let's do testcontoso.onmicrosoft.com, right? Now what happened is when they started the pilot, they were using the testcontoso.onmicrosoft.com. And when they went into production, moving all the users, they realized that this is the domain, this is not going to change, and now every user within that environment has testcontoso.onmicrosoft.com, right? So you want to make sure that you properly plan before you sign up. The second one I want to bring up is look out for the eval and the test tenants. Now, what happens typically is customers sign up for an eval, they want to test some domain within it. So instead of, along with your onmicrosoft.com domain, you can also add your vanity domains like contoso.com within Office 365, right? So what we have seen is somebody will add contoso.com to their test domain, and then they'll sign up for another tenant for production, right? Now, because contoso.com is already registered in this test tenant, it cannot be again registered in a different tenant. So that's something you want to watch out for. Now, it becomes very difficult from a support perspective here because because of our privacy policies, may not be able to tell you who owns the tenant. We may not be able to give you the email address, who actually owns the tenant, who registered within your company that particular domain. So you may have to go back to your business groups that are signing up for test tenants to make sure or to understand who signed up for a test tenant, who signed up for the tenant, and work through those channels. Okay. The second resource you want to use before you start deploying Office 365 is definitely use onramp.office365.com. Now, this is a tool that will basically run against your Active Directory environment, run against your environment, and it gathers a lot of information and does what we call an analysis. It looks at the issues that can happen when you move to Office 365. Things like, are my directory objects properly configured? Do I have the proper network ports open to make that connection to Office 365? Do I have, if I'm using Lync, it does go across, Lync, SharePoint, and Exchange. So, if you're using Lync, does it have, all the DNS records in there? Typically, I recommend customers do this on ramp before and after they deploy Office 365, so that, before, you do a check, and after you deploy, make a check so that it's all green. The other resource also that you want to make sure that you want to run before you start migrating to Office 365 is IDFix. Now, IDFix is a tool specifically when you are using directory synchronization, right? So this is a tool that goes against your Active Directory environment and looks for all the user objects, all the objects within your Active Directory, and check for things like, can this cause an issue when you are trying to sync that information to Active Directory? So things like invalid attributes, duplicate SMTP addresses are the ones that get checked. Now, from my experience, the IDFix as well as OnRamp checks two different types of information. So I've been more successful personally running both the tools and fixing the issues that were identified in both the tools. That gave me a better end result when we actually start the directory synchronization process. So I'm going to actually show a quick demo of IDFix just to help you understand what it does, how you can use it. Yeah, before that, this is how the service descriptions look. If you want to see, for example, if you want to go to Exchange Online, and it has all the information around, for example, Exchange Online limits, and you can look through this and read through what are the limits that are available for each of the different components, like message rate limits or mailbox sizes with the different plans, etc. TrustOffice365.com, as I said, this is the place where you want to go for information around privacy, compliance, and security. And then the deployment guide is the place where you want to go for, how do I get started with Office 365? How do I pilot? What are the components that are needed? As I said, it goes through very detailed information on what do I need to plan for Office 365. As you can see, you can use things like, what are the readiness things that are needed? What are the changes that I need from a network perspective? Can the guys in the back see? Right, maybe I'll. And also, if you're doing Exchange Online, what are the things that I need to plan, from an email migration perspective? How do I do a hybrid deployment? How do I plan for an IMAP migration? So going back to the IDFix. So it's a very lightweight tool. Just use your favorite search engine, right? Bing. Anybody? Come on. All right. So just search for IDFix. You can download this tool. You just run it. By default, you just use query to query it, right? And it will bring out the information around all the objects that that are having issues. One thing I wanted to highlight in this one was, look at the domain that was identified as a top-level domain. It's called exlab.local in my scenario. Now, this is an issue because Office 365 requires a publicly available domain name. So, for example, it has to be resolvable publicly. So, most customers, when they start with the initial versions of Active Directory, they went with domain names like exlab.local, so that the UPN stays user@exlab.local or ad.local, things like that. Now, if you have a UPN that's specified that way, you want to make sure that you add an additional UPN to the users so that it's in a supported state within Office 365. If it's in this state, it is not going to sync to Office 365 Windows Azure Active Directory. This tool also identifies a lot of other scenarios. For example, you can see I have a formatted issue here with a particular attribute. In this case, it is the mail nickname. So if you have any mail nicknames that could cause issues, it's going to identify that this is the attribute that you need to fix. It also will identify things like if you have duplicate SMTP addresses. So if there is a duplicate SMTP address within your environment that could cause issues with the synchronization, this tool is going to find for you. Now, the other advantage with this tool is it will also give you the option to update. So it will give you examples around how do I fix this particular attribute. For example, in this scenario where we had a mail nickname issue with a dot, it gives me saying you have to remove the dot. And you can also actually use the tool to update it. So you can just use the tool to update the attributes as well if you want. And it has all the mechanisms to roll back if you want. It does all the things for you. So that's IDFix. Those are the three things. Make sure you have the right tenant name. Make sure that you run the on-ramp tool. Make sure you run the IDFix before you start your Office 365 migration. Now, Once you are ready to migrate, now we're going to talk about the issues once you start migrating the users. What are the things that we're going to see when you actually start the migration process. Now, typically, most customers, most environments are hybrid migrations. So the first issue we're going to talk about is with the email address policies. How many of you actually fear email address policies? He is like me. He is like me. I fear email address policies. There you go. How many of you actually accidentally hit apply on the email address policies and updated all the SMTP addresses in the environment? There's a mini me there, right? So, yeah, right? So, when we run this hybrid configuration wizard, when you actually configure the hybrid configuration wizard, one of the things that the hybrid configuration wizard does is to add a coexistence domain. The domain name will be your domain that you signed up, when you signed up for Office 365 tenant. It will be domain name .mail.onmicrosoft.com. And this domain name gets added to all the email address policies within your environment for wherever you have registered the vanity domain. So for example, you want to use contoso.com in Office 365 and you registered contoso.com in Office 365. It's going to look at the email address policies within your environment, see which of the email address policies has the primary SMTP address as contoso.com and add this as the secondary domain. Okay. Now, the end result for this is if you are in a bad state within Active Directory, your results are going to be really bad. And this has happened with multiple customers that we work with. So why is this an issue? So what happens is, this is an example of the hybrid configuration wizard log. As you can see on the top, it does the set-email address policy. That's the place where it's actually adding the domain to the email address policy. The second thing that most people don't look at is the update-email address policy. Now this one is the one that's actually applying that policy to the objects that fall under the category of the email address policy. So you can see where that log is found here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show a demo on how it looks. We're going to go through the same scenario so that you have a better understanding of this. So I have my Exchange environment here. I have a couple of recipients, Sarah Davis and John Doe, and then I have my email address policy. I just have a default email address policy. And within this default email address policy, I have my email address format as primary address being demo.com. So if I'm doing the same things that the wizard's doing, what it's doing at this point is it's actually adding a domain called Contoso or mail.contoso.onmicrosoft.com like this. So if you have, we typically see two scenarios. The first scenario being a user who has a special email address that doesn't fall under the policy guidelines. Most of you are probably familiar with this unchecking the box which says do not apply the email address policy to the users. What happens there is, if you want to give a special email address to a user, you have to uncheck it to actually apply that email address, right? So you uncheck that scenario. That's one scenario. The other scenario is using non-exchange tools to update information, right? So in this example, I'm going to Sarah Davis, for example. She falls under the email address policy guidelines. But let's imagine somebody used Active Directory users and computers to update her email address from Sarah to, I don't know, Sarah, right? Hey, my name changed from Kamal. It used to be Kamal before I moved to US, and after I moved to US, it's Kamal, right? So there you go, Sarah, right? Now, somebody, Sarah calls up saying, hey, I moved to US, I want to get my name updated to Sarah. Somebody changed it, the help desk guy updated it to Sarah. Now, if you go back to Exchange, does Exchange update the email address for that user? No, because Exchange doesn't know that the change happened. Now, what happens if the hybrid configuration wizard runs and says, apply the policy? It will update the SMTP address for the user because the email address policy says it's first name dot last name, which will update the primary SMTP of the user from whatever it is to this address, right? So I'm going to hit apply here, right? So this user's email address is not updated within Exchange yet. Now I'm going to add this email domain for the user. So not for the user, for the email address policy. I'm going to save. I did give this machine like 16 gigs of memory so that it runs fast. All right, so now you can see that it's not applied. Now what is happening is once you hit apply, this policy is getting applied to all the users in the environment that fall under this policy guidelines. So if I look at the users here, now for example, Sarah Davis, right? So you can see that the email address has updated for the user. And it's the primary SMTP address that's updated. Meaning we never actually delete the old addresses, we just update them, we just add them, right? So but the primary, the reply to address has changed for the user. Now that's an issue for some people. Now the second issue is the users that have that box unchecked where we said, don't apply the policy for this user. Now they are not actually going to get the email address because we said don't apply the policy for this user. Now this is an issue for this user when you're trying to migrate to Office 365, right? Because unless you have that SMTP address, that's the mail routing address, they're not going to move to Office 365. So making sure that you fix these issues, making sure that that's checked, and making sure that the primary SMTP addresses for the users actually match the policy requirements. Okay. Another common issue we also see is with old legacy email address policies. Now, typically people who have migrated from Exchange 2003 to 2010 to Office 365, some of them, me personally, fearing touching email address policies, never updated email address policies to the OPATH filters from the LDAP filters. Now, when you have that scenario, when you don't do this, the hybrid configuration wizard is going to fail and say that you did not update your email address policies. So make sure if you are coming from Exchange 2003, make sure that you update your email address policy filters from LDAP to OPATH. The next common scenario we also run is with mailbox moves. Now that you're migrating, the first thing we run into is mailbox moves. We typically see this, and in a very large number of environments. Surprisingly, what we see is there are certain requirements for the mailbox moves to work. The way the mailbox moves work in Office 365 is there is a MRS server, the mailbox replication service in the Office 365 that's going to talk to a MRS proxy on your on-prem environment. The MRS proxy on your on-prem environment is going to talk to your mailbox servers and actually pull the data in and move the mailbox, right? So in order for that, you actually need to enable the MRS proxy using that MRS proxy enabled feature using the set- web services virtual directory. Now, typically, when you run the hybrid configuration wizard, it does set that for you. But for some reason, customers update it, disable it. So make sure if you're seeing issues where the moves are not happening, you want to check for this configuration. The other two parameters also are the internal authentication methods and the external authentication methods. Now, these two, what we see is, we are missing the WS security from the supported authentication methods. The reason we typically see this is if customers do a reset of their virtual directories, like delete and recreate, sometimes they run into issues with the virtual directories and they just delete and recreate the virtual directories. Those are not set by default. So, you have to go in and manually set them. So make sure that when you see that the mailbox moves are failing, make sure that you check for those three parameters specifically. Another common issue we also see is getting throttled. So obviously Office 365 is a multi-tenant environment. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to a lot of people. So we do throttling behind the scenes so that everybody gets their budget, everybody stays within their budget, right? So there are three types of throttling that you have to understand. The user throttling typically happens when user is uploading a PST to their Office 365 mailbox. That's a type of migration some people have used, and not many enterprises or not many medium businesses use it. The second and foremost, the most common scenario is the migration service throttling. Now, this happens in almost all the categories of all the different types of migration. What this is obviously because it's a multi-tenant environment, we have certain restrictions on the amount of data you can transfer at a time, right? So you get throttled when you try to move very large amounts of mailboxes or large amounts of data at a time. So understand that you could get impacted with the migration service throttling. The third one is the resource health throttling. Now this is on the Office 365 side. So let's imagine you're trying to move a mailbox, it is moving, and then suddenly the CPU on that mailbox went 100% for some reason, right? So mailbox move may get a lower priority, and you could get throttled because end user has to have the best experience at that point, right? Because the user is using their Outlook, so you may get throttled when those scenarios occur. We don't see that happening a lot. Most of the throttling that we see happens within the migration service throttling. Now, typical migration rates we have seen is about 0.3 to 1 GB per mailbox per hour. That's the averages we have seen. It's about 0.3 to 1 GB when we are trying to move a mailbox per hour. You can get better throughputs when you do concurrent moves. So typically the way you could do it is open up multiple Exchange Management shell sessions, right? Instead of just doing one move within one shell, just open up multiple Exchange PowerShell sessions and then do multiple moves, so that you do concurrent moves at the same time. Yeah, sure. Yes, yeah. So that's a good point. So you have the option to increase. There is a scenario where if you open multiple sessions, you may get terminated, or your session gets disconnected after a while. The PowerShell sessions, like after 3. Yeah, after 3. Yes, yes. This is a typical scenario we run into. It typically says, when you look at the error logs, it says relinquishing job. Typically happens at about 95%. Mailbox moved 95%, and then it says, I'm relinquishing the job. So the reason we typically see this is, digging through the logs, and there's a small commandlet that you can leverage to actually look into, that particular error. First one is large mailboxes. And within those large mailboxes, when you look, it's not the user content that's the problem there. Usually happens when you have a calendar versioning store that's very large, or if your dumpster is very large. The calendar version store typically is large because a device or something that's actually doing a lot of updates happening, and it's adding to the calendar version store. So typically what I suggest is look through, do a get dash mailbox statistics, look through the whole mailbox size and see if you have a large calendar version store, disable it, and then start the move. We also see some issues with incremental syncs. So what happens at 95% is, so the mailbox data moves till 95%, and then it does an incremental sync. So till that point, it's doing a copy, and then it does an incremental sync at that point. So it's basically checking for any changes that has happened from the start of the mailbox move. So after it moves 95%, and if it sees a large number of changes, typically it will relinquish the job. And the reason for that is, and the reasons we saw why those incremental changes are very large is if you have some software that's actually scanning the mailbox and doing updates, things like archiving software. The one thing to note though is if you move a mailbox and if it moves at 95% and you make one MAPI property change in the source, right? It's not syncing just the MAPI property, it's actually syncing the whole mail item. So let's imagine a full scan of your mailbox. It's going to resync all the mail items as well. So, and that's where you'll see that it's going into that state. Now you'll also see a relinquishing job if there are conditions where you see unfavorable server health. This would be scenarios where the CPU or something's happening within the service. So how do I improve the mailbox performance? It's very important to understand that the data source is critical. Meaning, so if you're coming, especially from third party like Google, they actually limit the amount of data you can transfer within an hour. So within a particular period of time. So make sure you understand what the limitations are within the data source. We also seen difference with the type and density. What I meant by there is, let's say imagine you have a 4 gig mailbox. And let's say you have 400 items that are 10 MB. They actually move faster than, let's say you have 100,000 items that are very small. So depending on, it's your end user expectation setting at that time, right? So make sure end users understand that, if you have large number of items, you may get lucky, you may move faster than somebody who has, small number of items. Migration server performance. Now, as I said, the way it works is there is a MRS service in the cloud that's talking to the MRS proxy on-prem. Right, so that's a component that's running on your hybrid server, that's running on your server that's on-prem when you're doing the migration. So what we have seen is people typically just they just say it's a migration server. They'll put a VM, 2 gig memory, 3 gig memory, and just try to use it. So that doesn't work. This migration server has to be really powerful. It needs the resources to actually do that migration for you. And we also have seen better performance when you scale out. Like meaning you put more migration servers so that you're moving more, you're doing more concurrent moves at the same time. Yeah.
When you say scale out, is there a ratio of number of hybrid servers that you have to have to a certain amount of users that you're moving, or is it based on size or number of users?
Yeah, it typically depends on it's very environment specific. We really have to understand what your environment has in terms of the mailbox sizes, number of users, and then we can go into the details of of the sizing. Typically, what we recommend customers do is use the Exchange Storage Calculator. That's our guideline for how do you scale or how do you size an Exchange environment.
No, I mean for the hybrid server.
Yeah, for the hybrid servers as well, we typically recommend use the Exchange Storage Calculator. Right. Yeah, again, as I said, so the question was for sizing the hybrid servers, do we have any specific guidance? And the guidance typically is use the mailbox storage calculator to identify the number of servers you actually need based on the number of users you have. You can use the storage calculator to identify, like the number of mailbox. You don't need the storage, but you need the servers, the memory, the capacity. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure why that recommendation was made, but let's take that discussion offline and we can talk about it. So a couple of other things we also saw. These are around your network configurations. Who blames network when there is an issue with Outlook? Everybody, right? There you go, Exchange admins. Right. So yeah. All right. So what we have seen is obviously bandwidth, latency are very critical. Understand that the bandwidth and latency do impact the mailbox moves. But you also want to, if you're using TMZ or any other firewalls that actually have the flood mitigation feature, we have seen that when you are doing the moves, that feature will actually decrease the throughputs we can get with the mailbox moves. So if you're using TMZ, make sure that you uncheck that option which says use flood mitigation. I've also seen bypassing proxies has changed. Proxies are things like when you have outbound internet proxies. where users are required to go through the proxy when you're transferring data to the internet, right? So we have seen drastic improvements when we bypass the proxy servers. Another important factor, if you're using load balancers, we also have seen better performance when you are able to persist to a particular cache server. Now, typically, it's not required to persist, but if you do persist to a particular cache server, using the Exchange cookie with an EWS request, you would get better throughputs with the mailbox moves. So that's with mailbox moves. The next common issues that we see is with the hybrid mail flow. Now, hybrid mail flow is a scenario where you're doing the migration, so you set up your hybrid environment. Now, in this state, you have to set up this hybrid configuration, and your mail, some of your users are on-prem, and some of your users are within the cloud. So when you are in that particular scenario, and you're trying to send mail between these environments, we have seen issues with TLS filtering, for example. The way the hybrid mail flow works within the environments is, it uses TLS, obviously, and with a domain, checking the domain on the certificate that's being used. So if TLS doesn't work between Office 365 and your on-prem Exchange servers, you run into issues where the mail won't flow properly. So common issues we have seen, TLS filtering happening at the firewalls. We also have seen at the SMTP fix-up, typically with Cisco firewalls, they have this option. We want to make sure that's unchecked. We also have seen issues with if your IP address is on the block list. So Office 365 or Exchange Online Protection doesn't expose *TLS verb if your IP address is in the block list. So make sure check that as well. And if you're trying to troubleshoot this scenario, you can either directly use Telnet, just use Telnet from your Exchange server to the EOP endpoint, and it will just do allo command, and it will show you the verbs that it supports. And if you don't see *TLS, that means that there is an issue somewhere where *TLS is getting blocked. You can also use the protocol logging within the Exchange environment. Another common scenario we see is the resolution of the P2 header. Now, because the way the hybrid's configured, the way it looks for an end user perspective is it's all one environment. So if the mailbox is on-prem, if the mailbox is in the cloud, it doesn't matter for the end user. When they look at Outlook and a mail comes from a on-prem user to Office 365, it looks like as if it's coming internally. And the way that happens is because we use a particular header called MS Exchange org auth. And depending on how that configuration comes through, right, it could be either internal or anonymous. Now, in order for it to make sure, or in order to make sure that it's working properly, you want to check that header and make sure it's set to internal. And the reason typically it's not set to internal is, if your mail's not actually following the route it should supposed to follow. So instead of following a connector that's directly going through EOP, it's probably going through the internet to EOP. Or the TLS has been disabled for some reason on that send connector by somebody. Or the Exchange certificate needs to have the domain name that's specified within the hybrid configuration wizard. And if the domain name's not on the certificate, the TLS sessions doesn't get established. Now, typically, most of the times to resolve this issue, you can check the remote domain settings, you can check the TLS settings, but what I typically recommend is just rerun the hybrid configuration wizard so that it actually sets all the properties for you. We wanted to add the load balancer thing at the end, because what we also have seen is if your load balancer doesn't do a pass-through of the IP address, so your Exchange has an IP address, and then load balancer has an IP address. If the IP address that's presented to Exchange Online Protection, EOP, is the IP address of the load balancer, right? It's not actually passing the IP address of the Exchange server. And when you run the hybrid configuration wizard, you specified the IP addresses of the Exchange server, right? So make sure that understand which IP is being exposed to EOP. And if that IP is not properly exposed, you run into issues with this. There is also a Mailflow guided walkthrough. Definitely, if you're running into issues, and if these two are not the common issues that you see, walk through this guided walkthrough. It's an excellent resource. It actually asks you a series of questions and walks you through your scenario. Why does network come up all the time, right? So the next thing we want to talk about is the common issues we see post deployment when the users are actually in a run state. So obviously with firewalls, proxy servers, what we have seen, and stateful packet inspection is the one that I came across recently supporting a customer. Their firewall does stateful packet inspection, and this has caused issues with Windows XP clients that's not able to. Looks like somebody else ran into that issue. Windows XP clients not able to make connection to the Exchange Online environment, right? So I said to the customer, hey, why don't you call me after April 8th? Best answer, right? And for those who don't know, Windows XP support goes on April 8th, and that's the reason. TCP idle session. So this would be, by default, Windows has an idle session timeout of 2 hours, right? And if your firewall or if your load balancer is dropping the sessions before that time, right? You run into issues where a user sends an email and it sits in the outbox, or they suddenly get authentication prompts. We also seen issues if your proxy servers have authentication. So if your proxy servers requires authentication, we have seen issues where Outlook, you'll see disconnects within Outlook. Typically, the scenario is you want to bypass the authentication for the Exchange traffic going to Office 365. WAN accelerators. I love WAN accelerators because they do preserve a lot of bandwidth for the end users. But understand the support stance when you're using WAN accelerators. The reason we want to put this here is when you have WAN accelerators within between your on-prem environment and your Office 365 environment, in order for us to troubleshoot or help you with the issue, we do require you to bypass that to help you troubleshoot. So make sure when you're planning, make sure that you have that in your plan as well, in your support plan as well. NAT, obviously bandwidth, you want to make sure that you have bandwidth. And we'll look at a particular scenario in the next couple of slides on why bandwidth becomes an issue. NAT. Now, if you're using NAT, obviously, we have a maximum of 64,000 ports that can be supported, from a NAT single IP perspective, right? So, if an Outlook client, they have done some optimizations in the recent versions of Outlook 2013, where the number of connections going to Office 365 are at like 2 or 4 at a minimal state. But when you're using older versions like Outlook 2010, what we have seen is they do open up 8 or more connections to Office 365. So if you have, say, delegates, or if you have group mailboxes that you add to it, you keep on adding to those connections. So what happens is the number of devices that you can put behind an NAT device becomes limited when you are in that scenario. So make sure you plan for that as well. Now this is the most controversial one. So typically, customers, they want to filter out the traffic going to internet, right? So they want to monitor it. They want to do, some internal investigation on it. So the traffic going to Office 365 obviously is going through, the internet, right, to connect to Office 365 service. What we have seen is people love to put IP restrictions on them. So basically saying, Office 365 is these set of IPs, and I want to add these IPs to the exclusion list. Now, we don't typically recommend it, and I'll show you the reason why in a bit. We always recommend using the URL filtering rather than the IP address filtering. And the reason for that, one of the biggest reasons for that is Office 365 actually leverages some of the third-party content caching engines, like Akamai, for example. And we use that for static content. Your data is actually in Office 365 data center secure, but if you have static content like images, for example, right? Those are static. Those are not going to change. So those are the ones that gets sent to you from these content delivery networks. Another scenario is, depending on where your client is, you could get different IP addresses connecting to yourself. So I'm going to show a small demo on it. So I have my Office 365 client here. I'm going to open up Fiddler. This is the one which basically will give us some guidance around what URLs are being accessed. I'm going to open up my Outlook web app. So as you can see, within this application, once I launched it, you can see I'm making connection to obviously outlook.office365.com, and you also see a couple of other connections, for example, XSI and res4.res.outlook.com. So let's look at first, look at outlook.office365.com, right? So if I'm using a DNS, who uses MX Toolbox? Everybody, right? So let's look at outlook.office365.com and look at the IP address that I get for this. As you can see, I got from the global DNS. I go through it. Obviously because I'm in North America, I'm getting outlook.namsouth.office365.com, and the IP address associated with that is like 132 something, right? Now, if I go to a different data center, like if I'm querying a DNS server that's in a different location, and I query for the same one, now this is some place in Europe, and you can see that the IP addresses that I got here are totally different, right? So you cannot typically restrict it based on the region. So if you want to do it on region, it's really difficult. You have to understand that depending on where your client is querying the DNS servers, Office 365 DNS servers may give you IP addresses from different locations. The second one I wanted to show was, so as we saw, the other connections that we made were, for example, the res4.outlook.com, right? So if I look at the IP addresses for this, as you can see, they are actually coming from Akamai, right? So things like static images, cat pictures here, right? So they actually come from those content delivery networks, right? So because they are static images, the static content, so that you have the best experience. And the reason why we don't want you to use IP restrictions is because of this. We don't control the CDN IP addresses. We don't control the content delivery networks, right? They can change the IP address behind the scenes. And for us to get that IP information and publish it so that you can add that, can take a longer time and then impact the end user. So, try to use URL filtering rather than IP address filtering. So I want to bring up, this is the most common issues we see. Most customers don't upgrade their clients, at the same pace Office 365, changes its, components or adds more components to it. So best experience, you want to be on the latest browsers, latest Office, latest apps. Even Outlook 2010 is an older app now, right? Because you want to make sure that you are on the latest one to get the best experience out of Office 365. If we don't deliberately prevent connections, if you're using older versions of Outlook, or older versions of browsers, we don't, basically block those connections. There is no restrictions. You can still connect, but you'll have a diminished experience. For example, if you're using IE8, the best you could probably get is just the overlight, for example, right? So you may not be able to leverage the full functionality of it. Also understand the difference when you're in mainstream support, extended support, and when you're on out of support. So for example, IE8, we just learned yesterday, is out of support, which means that Office 365 team is not going to test or fix bugs, for example, that result because of IE8. Okay. This is one of the most common issues we also see when you're in a run state, Outlook connectivity. we have two tools that you can leverage. The first one being the Outlook Connectivity Guide walkthrough. It actually asks you a series of questions and walks through the different scenarios that you can run into and helps you find a resolution. Okay. The other one is online service diagnostics and logging. Now this is a tool we typically use, but you can also run the tool, look at the data. This does a lot of gathering of the information around, what services are running. Am I able to connect to all the ports using all the port query? So it has all the built-in tools to check for your connection to Office 365 and give you the details around it. So you can look into the logs. They are very they're very detailed. So it will try to connect to outlook.office365.com. Am I able to connect to port 80? Am I able to connect to port 443? And reports within those logs. We also seen issues around Outlook performance. The best way to get the best experience, again, as I said, make sure that your Outlook is up to date. Always check for your connection status. If you go to the connection status within Outlook, you can see the average response time, and any failed requests. So, they should be low. Make sure that they are within the limits. Also, how many of you are you familiar with the OCAT tool, Outlook configuration tool? So if you're not familiar with it, make sure that you add it to your toolbox. That's a tool that the support folks released, which actually checks your Outlook configuration both on. It can be used both on-prem and Office 365 Outlook clients, but it will check for any issues that we know of that can cause issues with the Outlook. One recent scenario that I ran into is. The customer called and said, hey, all of a sudden all my mails from my applications going into the junk mail folder. And this is because of a change that happened with Exchange. This is an on-prem scenario with change happened with the Service Pack 1. And because of that change, this mail's going into the junk mail. Now, we also have seen the same issue in Office 365 as well, where some of the mail go into their junk mail folder. They are working through it. We don't have a resolution on that yet, but they are working through it. OAB is another scenario where, for some reason, what we have seen is customers, when they are on-prem, even though they have an offline address book, typically specify or force Outlook to use the online address book for some reason. Now, because of they have the same configuration when they move to Office 365, their Outlook's launching, again, trying to do an online address book connection. So they're not actually using the offline address book. So make sure if you have deployed those scenarios, make sure to check those as well. The next one being PST files or OST files. How many of you don't like PSTs? Right. Now you're going to hate OSTs because no, you're not going to hate OSTs. So the size of OST does matter in this scenario, and the reason for that is, because Office 365 gives you a very large mailbox, 50 gigs, right? And you're trying to cache all that information down to your Outlook client. Now, all this information go into this OST file, right? That's the cached information. You want to make sure that your OST file, the access of this OST file is better. And what I meant by that is, OST is a database of its own. So it does random reads, it does random writes from that file. So if your disk is not able to perform the speed at which Outlook needs it, right? You're going to see Outlook hang. You're going to see end user experience suffer. So you can actually check the speed of your disk. You can just run that command there. And personally what I've seen is anything below 15 MB per second is really bad experience for the user. And this typically happens when you have mailboxes that are larger than 10 gigs and you're trying to cache. Now, how many of you are familiar with the slider option in Outlook 2013? Yeah, most of you are. So use that option if you want to control the size of the OST that gets downloaded as well. Another big issue, shared mailboxes. Now, what happens is shared mailboxes are like group mailboxes or mailboxes that you have full access permission to. So by default, when you just add a mailbox permission to an end user, Outlook 2010 and up, what they do is they actually look at Active Directory and try to map all those mailboxes that you have full access to your Outlook profile, right? So imagine a user having access to 50 mailboxes, right? Now all those 50 mailboxes try to get loaded within Outlook, and it could diminish the performance of the user. And imagine if that user actually checked an option which says download download the cached folders or download the shared folders. Now it's going to download all those folders as well, and cause the OST size to bloat. So what you can do is, when you actually add the permission, there is an option at the end where you can say auto mapping is false, which will prevent the Outlook from loading that into the Outlook profile. Auto discover, I don't know why, but customers still like to configure their profiles manually. And no, don't go there. Just use auto discover. Auto discover is the way to configure your Outlook profile, especially when you're in Office 365. A couple of things you need to make sure for auto discover to work properly is you need to have a autodiscover.yourdomain.com, because that's the primary SMTP address of the user, pointing to the autodiscover endpoint, which is autodiscover.outlook.com. Now, for some reason, we have seen a lot of customers don't have that autodiscover record within DNS, and that could cause issues. There are also a few required attributes. If you don't have those attributes, the end user profile is not going to get auto-configured automatically. If you are in a hybrid configuration, you want to point your autodiscover record to your on-prem environment. Now, most customers, what I have seen is, because they just want Office 365 is a large environment, they want to point it to Office 365. That doesn't work for all the configurations. You want to make sure that when you are in hybrid, you want to point it to you want to point it to your on-prem environments. And that brings up another point where you want to make sure that you scale your client access servers and your mailbox servers in 2013 to support that load as well. Okay, because it's all auto-discover requests that are hitting there first and then getting redirected to Office 365. Mobile devices. How many of you have dealt with mobile devices in Office 365? Right. So one thing we want to bring out is, when you actually move the mailbox to Office 365, right, you have to manually reconfigure the profile for the user. Now, it doesn't automatically update itself. So plan that as a part of your migration process. Now, if you are using the best phone, right, the Windows phone, right, I have seen it update its profile all the time, but with the other phones, you have to manually reconfigure it. Another issue we also commonly see with mobile devices is throttling. Always remember that within the service, within Office 365, there is throttling. If the end user is affecting the Office 365 service, they get throttled. And the way you can check that is, you can collect the ES logs. Are you familiar with how to collect the ES logs within from an end user perspective? So what you can do is have the user log on to OWA, go into their options, and there is a mobile phone option, and you can just click a button, say start collecting ES logs. And once you collect the ES logs, you can use this tool called Mailbox Log Parser. It's a tool that's available in CodePlex. You can download it and look through the content. What you'll see there is, you'll see an error like 503, which basically is saying service unavailable. And when you see this, what is happening is the service is throttling your device, meaning it's not allowing you to connect or make that connection to the service. I have seen this very recently with most of the Android phones happen. So the fix for it, unfortunately, is you have to wait 10 minutes. Tell that to your CEO, right? Not happy. But the other option is, switch them to manual sync, like, sync every 5 minutes. Typically, that did resolve the issue as well. Another common issue we also see is with FreeBusy. There are tools that are available that you can leverage. The first one being the Remote Connectivity Analyzer tool. Always start with that when you run into FreeBusy issues. Like you're trying to query a FreeBusy for an on-prem user from an Office 365 mailbox or vice versa. Always start with the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. You can also leverage the online diagnostic tool, but there is also a guided walkthrough which will actually step you through the process. the one thing I want to highlight here is understand how FreeBSD actually works when you're in a hybrid. There are two components that you need to understand. The first one being the Microsoft Federation Gateway, and the other one being the Office 365. The way it works is, if you query, from your on-prem environment, if you query FreeBSD for a user that's in Office 365, the first request usually goes to MFG, right? And if there are issues connecting to MFG, the FreeBSD, the rest of the process fails. We recently ran into an issue where they upgraded the certificates on MFG, and it caused FreeBSD issues between the premise environments. Though typically the way to remediate is you have to refresh the metadata for that connection. And then after that's done, the second piece is that's when you get the token from MFG, and then you pass that to Office 365. So understand that the failure could happen at either MFG or Office 365 connection as well. Couple of action items. We talked about all the issues that you can run into. Think about these issues when you're trying to deploy or when you're talking to your customers. Go through those issues, see if you ran into this, find the resolutions that you have seen. Definitely service descriptions, that's one tool I always have. Like TechNet, you are able to download it like a PDF now, right? You can go into TechNet and download it as a PDF. So make sure that you can download it, keep it with you, and review it for any questions you have regarding Office 365. And you can also use Fast Track. This, if you want to quickly start with a pilot, deploy, and migrate, just go to that fasttrack.office.com, and it has the guidelines on how to get started with Office 365. Some takeaways, be proactive, make sure that you check for all these issues when you plan, when you deploy, and when you maintain. I included some links around the tools that we all leverage when we are troubleshooting Office 365 issues. Go to that URL at the end, and it has a list of tools that you can leverage to troubleshoot issues with Office 365. Last but not the least, Premier support. If you're not familiar, we do have Premier support for Office 365. If you're an Office 365 customer, check with your account team on what is Premier support for Office 365, and talk to them how you can leverage the Premier support for it. So, questions?